This is an Evergreen Media Network studio production.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. Brett Haake. I'm here with my wife, Dr. Felice Haake. We are the Preventus Concierge Medicine podcast. We're live from one of my favorite places on the planet, beautiful and sunny, Vero Beach, Florida. I think it's about 75 degrees here today. Not to brag to any of our listeners who are up north, but I am rubbing that in a little bit. January and 75, it never gets old. We are today, we're going to begin the second podcast, part 2, in our insulin resistance discussion. And this is a topic that I think is gaining more and more traction in the public, but I still think it doesn't have nearly enough traction as far as just awareness and increasing the discussion as far as, just trying to understand what it is. So to summarize, Felice, what is insulin resistance? Let's kind of hit on what we talked about before.
Yes, and not to be too redundant for those who have really followed us through our couple podcasts. First of all, I have my Stanley Cup just to get me through. I know Brett hates Stanley Cups, by the way.
They're just like, they make a big deal out of something.
They're absolutely ridiculous.
Okay, so yeah, not to get off topic too much here, but the Stanleys are just too big for a glass of water, man. You need about a third of that.
Anyway, so insulin resistance, essentially, a mechanism, an underlying driving mechanism that leads to diabetes. Diabetes being the very late stage of insulin resistance. It is insulin being a hormone, but it acts as a key that opens the cell's channels to glucose. And over time, if that key doesn't work, then the sugars build out in the bloodstream, and more insulin has to build up in order to shove those sugars inside the cell. And that essentially is what insulin resistance is. And insulin likes to build fat. I mean, for the listener, that's what they're wondering about. How does this affect me? Well, for most people, it's what's leading to your fat gain and a difficulty in getting fat off.
So we're going to get into that. We're going to go into depth about risk mitigation strategies and all those kinds of things. But if we didn't make the point before, and I think we made it before in our previous podcast, let's make this point again. When people get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, the end-stage manifestation of insulin resistance is what we would call type 2 diabetes, and that's correct.
Yeah.
The reality is that you can have insulin resistance that is asymptomatic for long periods of time before you develop diabetes. And in fact, in some pieces of literature, I would argue most pieces of literature, about 50% of everybody that gets diagnosed with type 2 diabetes already has coronary artery disease. So the thinking is that coronary artery disease, which is what causes, commonly referred to as a heart attack, and is under the guise of vascular disease and diabetes, come from the same soil, and that soil is insulin resistance. So to your point, we should not necessarily be waiting for someone to get diagnosed with diabetes. We should actually be targeting and trying to reverse the insulin resistance.
Exactly.
Okay, so that leads us into the next question is, number one, how does insulin resistance lead to weight gain? Because usually people are coming to us, they're not saying, I need to reverse my insulin resistance. They're saying, geez, I'm 50 and I used to be able to lose weight easily and effectively just by working out and trying to eat clean and all, and now I've put on 20 extra pounds, and why is this? So how does insulin resistance cause weight gain?
Well, and it can be very complicated, but ultimately insulin, the hormone, is an anabolic hormone. It builds. And so when you have enough sugars in the bloodstream and the body doesn't know how to utilize those sugars, so it's basically a utilization defect. The body's not using those sugars. So like you look at kids and they can just like put away like junk food and you're like, how are they doing that? Their bodies are really adept at utilizing glucose or sugars, and they put it inside their cells and they use their muscles are using it. Well, as we get older, there's a lot of things that change, from a poor diet to just getting older, the aging mechanism alone, and we're not utilizing those sugars, and those sugars then get turned into fat. I mean, that is a very simplistic way of explaining what I think of as a very complicated process.
Okay, and to add to that, based on our experience and with patients and really trying to understand this disease, it's fair to say also that insulin resistance manifests at different organ systems and different cell types in different ways, but it's just important to understand that it's there, to measure it, target it, and then reverse it. So that leads me into the next question. You've got to, just based on your practice, there are, your typical patient might be the 50-year-old woman who is all of a sudden gained 20 pounds and has never looked the way that she looks and really, really, really wants to lose weight, or even this 50-year-old man. What are the things that you do right off the bat with those patients to not just lose weight, but really target the insulin resistance and focus on a preventative approach, a proactive and preventative approach? What are the strategies that you use?
I always make a joke with my patients, you know, you don't want to lose weight, you want to lose fat. I can chop off your arm, you'll lose weight. Okay, so the focus is really on body composition change. In our office, we have an in-body scale, which is a scale that looks at body composition, muscle and fat, et cetera. And so I really try to drive home that point, because a lot of women, they're very, in particular women, are very number oriented, and they'll say, oh, I lost 10 pounds. But when I look at the in-body and it's 5 pounds of muscle, I'm like, okay, we're not doing a good job here. So I do focus on body composition with them. Then it's really important that I discover if they indeed have insulin resistance, which the lab tests really help me discover. And there are really good labs where you can uncover insulin resistance way before it becomes diabetes. So once I uncover what's going on at an underlying level, and what's causing their weight, then we can really tackle it. Now, do you want me to go through kind of my strategies, my actual reversal strategies for insulin resistance once I've determined someone has it?
Absolutely. I thought you'd never ask.
Okay, so I sort of have a 5-pillar approach, and I know I said this on the last podcast, but we didn't get to go deep into it. So first is some time-restricted feeding strategies. So leaving a little bit longer time without food and without the recruitment of insulin. So for instance, if you're eating something in the morning, let's say an Egg McMuffin, then you're spiking your insulin pretty early on. But if you leave longer periods where the insulin levels are low in the body, so fasted means water, bubbly waters, Pellegrinos, unsweet tea, black coffee, that's not going to recruit insulin levels. Some people ask me about creamer. That's a very debated topic, but probably very little amount of insulin recruitment with creamer, non-sugary creamers, of course. So, leaving that longer period keeps the insulin levels low, which allows your body to actually tap into stores of, glucose and fat, essentially, to utilize that as energy. So just like your car needs gas, and when your gas gets low, the light comes on, you want to tell your body the storage is low, meaning the sugar storage is low. Let's start turning to another fuel source, which in our case, with bodies, not like cars, we can turn to fat. So you won't tap into fat stores, until you're about 11 or 12 hours into a fast. So I tell my patients, if you're eating at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and then your first meal is at 6 a.m. in the morning, not enough time. Really try at the very least to leave 12 hours of fasting, ideally 14 to 16 hours of fasting. There is one caveat, however, if you fast too long, I have some patients who fast for 20 hours. I don't often encourage this, because in that 4-hour period of eating, they often will either undereat or get undernutrition, and also they sometimes will overeat bad things because they're so ravenous. So I think there's a kind of a sweet spot for fasting.
So let's break that down a little bit more. I think that what you're saying is you hear a lot about in today's milieu intermittent fasting, and so intermittent fasting is basically a way for your body to become more insulin sensitive and less insulin resistant. And so based on that, if somebody goes to 20 hours, they've been fasting for 20 hours, your point is they don't eat enough in that 4-hour span, they may become undernourished, conversely, if they're so hungry that they overeat, their body may actually become insulin resistant during that time period. And so I guess the follow-on question to that is are there ideal fasting periods for people based on their body habitus, whether they're ectomorphic, mesomorphic, endomorphic, and or their age? So for instance, a kid that is a mesomorph and is 27, might that person have a different fasting strategy than somebody that is ectomorphic and 68?
Yeah, that's where the complicated differences amongst all of us come in. You know, we're all different genetic beings, and so ectomorph essentially means like a very thin habitus person, correct? And mesomorph is more a muscular person. They're just naturally muscular. And then endomorphs are more your for lack of a better term, fluffier people. I find that the smaller people, the ectomorphs, even those who have some excess fat on their body, but they have like kind of the thin, like smaller bones, small wrists, these patients don't do as well with longer fasts, in my opinion. They become more catabolic. They start catabolic meaning breaking down, and they break down muscle. And I don't want to see that. That's the last thing you want to do. That's the complete opposite of what we're trying to do. So I would say for those patients, be very careful, or those with lesser amounts of insulin resistance. Remember, insulin resistance being on a spectrum. Those on the lower end don't do very well with larger fasts. Those on the higher end, severe insulin resistance, tend to do better with larger fasts, so long as in that small window of eating that they don't overdo it. They don't turn to Reese's, and they don't like kind of lose their mind because they've been fasted for 20 hours. So it's sort of, again, it's very personalized.
Right. And this was going to lead to my next question, is that we tend to say, okay, we fit people, like I just said, okay, mesomorph 27, endomorph 58, and we tend to kind of have an idea as far as what type of time-restricted feeding pattern we want to implement. But you mentioned something at the outset, something that we do at Preventus, and that's an insulin resistance score. So if we start somebody on a specific fasting pattern, time-restricted feeding, we're going to look at their insulin resistance score at the beginning, and then we're going to talk to the patient. We're going to figure out, hey, do you feel better? Is your mind clear? Are you losing weight? What's your in-body? Have you actually, has your muscle percentage stayed the same? Your fat gone down? Or the exact opposite, and the insulin resistance score hasn't gotten any better, in which case we need to change course. We need to do something just a little bit different. And this is where not everybody fits neatly into the box that we expect them to fit. Patients respond differently to different things, and so we need to make those course corrections as we're fine playing. And the insulin resistance score and combined with the in-body is a valuable tool to do that. So you're talking about time-restricted feeding. What else as far as your strategies?
So that would be one strategy. And then let's add on to that. Now we're looking at the diet, okay, what you actually consume. So I really focus on patients taking in foods that are not going to recruit insulin to a high level. So you're talking about, proteins, vegetables, healthier fats. And this can get really, really detailed and in the weeds here. I tend to really promote Whole30 diet, paleo diet, Mediterranean diets. These diets really kind of simplify what you take in. When I tell my patients, think in terms of singular ingredients. There's no guesswork in chicken. Chicken is chicken. An asparagus is an asparagus. That's the ingredients. There's no guesswork. Whereas I would encourage someone to grab a lean cuisine, which is marketed to the consumer as healthy, grab it, from the freezer and in Publix, and tell me, read the back of that, read the ingredients. How many of those things do you recognize? That should alert you. That should put up your radar and say, wait a second. How good is this for me? There's a lot of things here that I don't understand what they are. So I tell my patients, try to just go back to the basics and think simply when it comes to food. And in particular, we want to eat foods that don't recruit insulin. So that means really eliminating to a large extent, not entirely, your carbs, your breads, your pastas, rices. The insulin resistant patient does not tolerate these foods very well. This is factual.
You have two terms for that. One, the type of diet that you're describing, I don't want to steal your thunder here, is called, what's your term for that?
An anti-inflammatory diet?
Low insulin recruiting diet, right?
Yes,
you call that the low insulin recruiting diet, and that's a term that you came up with. And so, I think that's hugely important. And basically what you're saying is avoid the processed food, avoid the things that you don't know what you're putting into your body. And so, fruits, vegetables, all those kinds of things. Now, we could really, really get into depth, and we'll probably do our own podcast with regard to diet and high fructose corn syrup, uric acid, and all those kinds of things. But for the sake of this discussion, so we've got diet, low insulin, low inflammatory diet, time restricted feeding. What else?
Can I just kind of add to the Whole30? A lot of patients might, or people listening might turn to Whole30 and open the book and just go, this woman's nuts. This is such an extreme diet. What I usually encourage my patients to do when they look at Whole30 diet, which the book is half recipes and the other half is didactic, it's teaching, I tell them, do not look at that as you have to do it 100%. I would really focus on, getting the basics. What I really like about Whole30 is it teaches you things like carrageenan. Had you ever heard of carrageenan before? Well, it's a thickening agent that they put in food. It's in a lot of creamers. It's a no-no on Whole30 because it's inflammatory. And, this book was written by 2 PhDs in nutrition who basically scoured the research to discover what actually are bad foods or bad ingredients that cause inflammation. And when you talk inflammation, we're often talking insulin resistance as well. So I just have to give that disclaimer about Whole30 because I get a lot of pushback from my current patients on that's too much. I don't expect you to be perfect, but isn't it nice to learn, hey, I'm going to choose a creamer that doesn't have carrageenan in it, and then I can just stick with that. So to answer your question, though, number 3 would be exercise with a strength-based focus. I have a joke, walk into a gym, stand at the door, and tell me where the fittest people are in the gym. Invariably, they're in the weight section. Okay. And I don't believe that fit people are attracted to the weight section. I think weight sections shape those bodies. So you look around, you see a lot of people standing on the treadmills for a long time, the Stairmasters, the bikes, and they're not really seeing results. And I know there's listeners who are like, yes, this is me. I feel like I work out 5 days a week. I'm doing all this cardio and I'm not seeing the results. They feel like they're doing more because they sweat, and you don't sweat as much with weight training for the most part. And so I think they undervalue what, it's worth, essentially.
Got it. So and the point I think here is that we have really an obesity epidemic in the United States. The sine qua non of this obesity is insulin resistance.
Yeah.
And yet we have gyms on every corner, and we still have the obesity. So when we talk about exercise, we're talking about an evidence-based approach that focuses on resistance training. Not that cardiovascular training is bad, but the focus is on resistance training, particularly as it pertains with women. And then the other thing we work with certain people in this community. There are a lot of good trainers in this community. One person in particular that we work with, his approach, if you've never worked out, is you walk into his gym and you work out 1 time a week. So you're not going to go in there and go into, work out so hard that you have all kinds of complications and you never come back again. You're going to start slow, focus on form and function, an evidence-based scientific approach. So that way you're coming back and now it becomes a lifestyle. It's not a fad, it's not a habit, or it is a habit, but it's a good habit, it's a lifestyle. So
yes, exactly.
So fitness, exercise, we talked about time restricted feeding, we talked about the low insulin, low inflammatory recruiting diet, Whole30. We talked about an evidence-based approach to exercise. What else? Well,
in between the diet and the exercise, I neglected to mention just the importance of protein. That was a big mistake of mine. So usually, if you look at the average American, I'll use a female, for example. The average female is taking in less than 60 grams of protein a day. They think that's enough. And it's enough by the RDA. Which we could get on that topic too. But essentially, that's just the RDA sets the value for the minimum that you need. not what's optimal. So, my patients, and depending on their weight and their size and their lean body mass, but I'm usually trying to push for them to get 35 to 40 grams, of protein per sitting, so that they're at least hitting 100 grams a day. Very few do that. So that's kind of just an introductory goal. Some might need to be even higher than that. But if you don't take in enough protein and then you don't stimulate the muscle to grow, it won't, and you will lose it. And as you age, there's a process called sarcopenia that just naturally occurs. And I forget the statistic on this, but after the age of 40, you start losing a certain percentage every year of your muscle mass. And females, it goes very fast because we don't start off with a lot to begin with.
And this is intimately related to osteoporosis, correct? The more a woman engages in resistance training, particularly as she hits menopause and then moves, through menopause, the resistance training actually stimulates bone health, correct?
Completely. Because, I explained to my patients, they're like, how does that work? How does that stimulate bone health? And I said, well, when you move your muscles, your tendons pull on the bone, and that sends a signal to the bone in the osteoblasts, which are cells in the bone that build bone. It sends the signal, we need to build, we need to get stronger. They're putting us under tension here. And so it is one of the most important things you can do as a female, especially, the classic female who gets osteoporosis, which is the frail, usually thin, Caucasian females.
Got it. Okay. So we've got the low insulin, low inflammation recruiting diet. We've got resistance training. We've got help me out here. What's the?
So you said resistance, and then I really focus on stress, stress reduction strategies. I've seen patients do every single thing right, meaning they're eating right. They're exercising right. They seem to be doing everything right. And they're like, what's going on? And, stress comes in different forms. Everyone knows the obvious stress, whether it's financial stress, family stressors, those kind of external forces. And then there's also things like just lack of sleep, shift work. I see so much insulin resistance in my shift workers, my patients who are like nurses that do the night shift. Their circadian rhythm presents a stress to the body. And so when you present a stress, your cortisol levels rise. And cortisol is a hormone that's secreted a lot of times in response to stress. We need it, by the way. We need it. 0 equals death. So we have to have some cortisol. We just need a balance. And when it's too high, it actually leads to secretion of sugars in the bloodstream, which, i.e., can cause insulin resistance without actually eating sugars.
Got it. So the last two pieces of that equation are going to be stress and sleep. Okay, so one of the things that I thought we would talk about just a little bit, and you're hitting on this just a little bit. So if you have somebody, and let's say they're doing all of these things and they're still insulin, let's say 48, and they're, let's say that they're, they weigh 20 more pounds than they did when they were 28. They want to lose these 20 pounds. They're doing all the things and they're still insulin resistant. Are there things from a hormonal level that, if not optimized, can actually contribute to insulin resistance?
Oh, absolutely.
In both men and women.
Oh, yeah.
What might some of those things be?
Absolutely. Testosterone deficiency. We talk about menopause very openly and candidly. We don't talk about, I'm not making a joke, but menopause, that men tend to, their testosterone levels decline, which then leads to loss of muscle mass, which then can lead to insulin resistance. Females, the same, the loss of the estrogen and progesterone. This is very protective against insulin resistance.
So hormone replacement therapy in both men and women, in those people who are deficient in an evidence-based way, can potentially make you more insulin sensitive. Yeah. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the distinction here also is that in women, the hormonal changes occur very abruptly. Menopause comes and it goes very abruptly. In men, the decline in testosterone is a gradual thing. And so oftentimes, if it occurs over a 10, 15-year period, your testosterone starts to drop at the age of 30, let's say. And by the time you're 45, you're like, man, I don't respond to the workouts. Right. I don't sleep as well. And it's something that's happened gradually. And so you don't really have a strong a hold on it. So it's something that we check at Preventus as well as hormonal optimization. So we've got a minute left. I think we've hit insulin resistance pretty hard. We've analyzed it pretty well. Before we leave, let's kind of summarize all of the things that we do, the risk mitigation strategies for insulin resistance, and maybe give some people some quick takeaways that they can do to reverse.
So I'll just repeat the 5 pillars, and then we'll do an entire podcast on medications to help reverse insulin resistance as well. So 1 is going to be your time-restricted feeding, kind of condensing the window you eat within. 2 is going to be what you eat. Watch those foods that recruit insulin, the carbs, the breads, the sugars. If you're going to eliminate something, that's where to go first. Watch what you drink as well, sugary beverages. 3, get into the gym. You don't have to overdo it. 2 days a week, 3 days a week. Start with weight training and do it the proper way and the safe way. 4, getting good sleep. And then 5 is working through stress, having outlets for stress. That would be what I'd say.
Got it. Thank you so much. That is our round 2 of insulin resistance with the Preventus Concierge Medicine podcast. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. This is Dr. Brett Haake and Dr. Felice Haake. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.